Good evening. I'm confused too, man, because the clock back there says like 6:25 still, but now it's like almost 35. I don't know. Maybe that's like in further west, so it's not quite as late yet. um, First of all, I was asked to make an announcement, so I printed the email. There is a card on the back table that is for Dylan Morgan because he's headed to Dallas next week for an internship as part of his education at Lamar. And the card is to wish him well and let him know that we'll be praying for him. If you don't know who he is, he's one on our janitorial staff, and so they've got a card back there. If y'all would sign it, just to let him know that we do appreciate him. So Brother Bill asked me to teach tonight because he's up in Boston, and I was really disappointed that I'm here and he's there because he went to Fenway Park, and I've always wanted to go to Fenway Park and watch a baseball game. Of course, I'd want to go when the Astros are playing and wear my Astros jersey right into Fenway Park and probably get beat up. But but anyway, he asked me to speak, and he told me that I could speak on anything that I wanted to. So I'm going to go over something that may be very familiar to you, but hopefully you've not heard all that I'm going to go over tonight, or if you have, maybe it'll remind you. But we're going to be where the prodigal son. We're going to be talking about the story of the prodigal son, or the lost son, and that is in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. But like I said, it's something very familiar probably to you, but Adam and I were doing a discipleship study about a year to a year and a half ago. We finished it about a year ago, and it took about 8 or 9 months to go through. But I learned some stuff about this story that I had never heard before, and so I'm going to share some of those things with you tonight. And so hopefully, like I said, maybe it's something you haven't heard before, but if you have, then maybe it's something that triggers a reminder to you on things we're supposed to do. So I've heard this story called a lot of different things before. I've heard it called or the story of the lost son, the story of the prodigal son, the story of two sons, the story of two brothers, the story of the parable of the forgiving father, or the parable of the loving father. And that one is actually my favorite, because the parable of the prodigal son, or the lost son, only talks about one of the sons, and it refers to one of the sons. So this other story actually refers, if you give it the other title of the loving father, I think it speaks more to what's going on in the story as a whole. So when we look at this, though, Jewish tradition often told stories about sons, or two brothers. In biblical history, we hear about Cain and Abel. We know how that turned out. Ishmael and Isaac. We know how that turned out. Jacob and Esau. We know how that turned out. So usually in these stories, the younger son or the younger brother is the more righteous or obedient or clever. But in this story, Jesus twists it around. And when he tells us when he tells his audience about the younger brother, who in this case appears to be more immature, more selfish, and more callous towards his family. So first of all, the word prodigal, I don't know, when I first heard this story, I always thought, well, it was someone that ran off and then came back. No, well, prodigal, when you look it up in the dictionary, is an adjective that means wastefully or recklessly extravagant. Or it can be a noun, which means a person that is wasteful with their money or possessions. You thought I was going to say wastefully extravagant. But that's why I also like the title of the loving father, because the prodigal son only refers to one son and one aspect of this story. But the other son has a few issues also that we're gonna look at. So we'll start reading in verse 11, and I'm just going to read a few verses and we'll talk about those, and we'll work our way through the whole story. So it says, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them." Okay? So just in these first 2 verses, we hear a lot, that according to these Jewish customs in Deuteronomy, the firstborn was entitled to a double portion of the inheritance. So in this case, the father would have divided his estate 3 ways. The younger son gets 1/3, the older son gets 2/3. In my mom's case, she has 4 sons. My oldest brother would get 2/5 of $20, and I would get 1/5 of $20. So, but this one, but also notice that the younger son, he didn't ask for his inheritance. He demanded it. He said, "Father, give me my inheritance." And so when he by demanding his inheritance while his father was still alive, the younger son had greatly insulted his father. And basically he said, "I know I'm going to get an inheritance when you die, but I can't wait. Can I have it now? And instead, I'll go and live my life how I want to, and I'll get out of your hair." And so when you read it with that kind of an attitude, a demanding attitude that he wants this, he really didn't love his father. He loved the things that his father could provide for him. And so, as I got to thinking about this, just like the younger son leaving his father, our problems usually begin when we try to seek autonomy from the God that created us. And we try to do things on our own. We think we know better, and we're quite capable of taking care of ourselves. And then when things don't work out, we're really quick to blame others, our circumstances, and sometimes even God. And so rarely will we acknowledge fault at first. It's never my fault. It's always something else made me, put me in this situation, made me get to this point. It's not my fault. And so, that's a very immature attitude, and obviously demonstrated by this young man, and I've done it a few times too. So the father at this point had every right to be humiliated, hurt, angry, and to reject the request and kick the son out of his house without a thing. Just go away. You wish that I were dead, go away. He had every right to do that. In fact, the community that they lived in probably would have sympathized with the father had he reacted like that. In fact, they probably would have even applauded the father for reacting in that way. But when we look at this, the father chooses to remain the younger son's father, even though the son no longer wants to be his son. He makes a conscious choice, and he says, "Okay, here's your portion of the inheritance. Your third. I give it to you." Even though the son says, "Dad, it's like you're dead to me," he's saying, "I'm still your dad, and here's your portion." So then going on in verses 13 through 16, it says, "Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed his pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." So verse 13 says that the younger son got together all he had, and this tells us that his intention is never to come back. I'm taking my ball and I'm going home. Okay, he's going to take everything he had, everything that his dad gave him, and he's leaving. And no intentions of coming home or returning. This is what he wanted. He was tired of living with parental restraint, and he wanted to be able to make his own decisions. Now, if you're a parent, You've probably heard this before at different ages of your kids. You know, I think my kids said it as early as like 4 or 5, you know. And I know I threatened to run away a few times from my mom, so she offered to help me pack. Not that she wanted me to go, but she just knew I wasn't going anywhere. So, so we're not told how long it actually took the younger son to squander all of his inheritance, but I will say this. We read about it at the beginning of 13, at the beginning of verse 13, and by the end of verse 13, it's gone. So however long one verse is, it didn't take him long. So then the land where he was living goes into this severe famine, you know, and it's probably drought, and there's not much food, there's not much of anything, no jobs, there's, you know, because a very agrarian society, you know, everybody was a farmer back then, just about. So things were tough. And so he's run out of friends, you know, and you know, you see this in our society today too, that whoever's got the money and is throwing all of the parties, he's got tons of friends. And when the money runs out, the friends go find someone else to leech off of. And so, and I think this young man probably found himself in that same position. You know, he was surrounded by people living the life of Riley, you know, and then the money runs out and he's looking around, where'd everybody go? And so it seems logical that he almost starved since there was a famine, and it says he began to be in need, which is interesting, a way to say I'm starving. I began to be in need. Okay? So how far did he sink? Yeah, he hit rock bottom, you know. So he was so desperate that he hired himself out to a pig farmer. You know, and obviously in the Jewish culture, pigs are unclean animals, and his job was to feed these animals, which I don't guess is a violation of laws, but because I went back and I looked, and in Leviticus 11, 1 through 8, it says this: the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, say to the Israelites, all of the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. There are some that only chew the cud or have a divided hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The hyrax, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. They are unclean for you. So touching their carcasses refers to once they're dead, they're not supposed to touch them. But it doesn't really say they can't feed them, but you know, you don't, I mean, to a Jew, a pig is very unclean. Now, I've eaten a couple of these animals on this list, not a camel or a hyrax, but I have had rabbit, it's very good, and I have had pig, of course. In fact, one of my best friends when I was growing up was Jewish, and we went to school together. We had a lawn mowing business together and that kind of stuff. And if I spent the night at his house, when in the morning on Saturday morning or so, you know, he would say, "What do you want for breakfast?" And I was like, "I don't know." And sometimes his parents had lox. If you don't know what lox is, it's Jewish soul food. You take an onion bagel and you toast it, and you put cream cheese on it and lox, which is really thinly sliced smoked salmon, and that is good. Okay, so I would like, you got lox, bagels, and cream cheese, you know? And when he would spend the night at my house, I was like, "What do you want for breakfast?" And he would say, "You got any bacon?" Because he loved bacon. This kid loved bacon, and his parents would not buy it, of course, because they were Jewish. So when he came to my house, his mom would probably be very upset with me if I would have told her back then, "Hey, Michael eats bacon at my house." You know, she probably would have, that would have been the last time he came to my house. So he didn't kill and eat any of the pigs. He didn't eat the pigs. He was just feeding them. But it does say that he longed to eat their food. So if you've ever fed a pig, they don't eat the top, you know, they're not they don't eat the good stuff. They eat the leftovers off of the table and that kind of stuff. So he was eating the waste food, and that's what the young son was feeding the pigs. Had he killed one of those animals and eaten it, then more than likely he would have at least been fired from that job, and he struggled to find that job. And worst case, he would have been brought before a judge for stealing and killing an animal that wasn't his. And then he would go to jail, but back then jail was different than jail is now. You had to have someone provide for you while you were in jail back then, and he didn't have anybody, so it would have been even worse for him. So if he could steal the food that the pigs were eating, it would be harder for the farmer to prove that he's eating that food unless he absolutely saw him. But he could get something, and nothing may be better than something. I don't know. Depends. So, but then going on in 17 through 19, it says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against you, against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So the Jewish phrase, he came to his senses, doesn't necessarily mean that he repented. Okay? I think that this time he remembered that his father's servants had plenty of food, and they were well fed, and they didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from, and he was starving. I think that's what it means when it says it came to his senses. He was like, wait a minute. So if he had truly been repentant, I think that he would have, his need for food may not have been his first thought. He would have been remorseful on how he treated his father if he would have been truly repentant. But it is a turning point in this story and in this young man's life. So many times we'll put up with a lot of self-destructive decisions until we hit that rock bottom, and he's there now. But a lot of times we'll do things that get us, and when we get to rock bottom, we stop, and it makes us think, what am I doing? And I think that's definitely where he is, He's looking at this bucket of slop, and he's like, well, I could eat that. And it probably triggered this, what am I doing? I could go home, and I would be better off than this. So I think it may be a last-ditch effort. Well, let me back up, because this rock bottom thing reminded me that I've got some family members that at different times in their lives, usually their late teens and early 20s, they had problems with drugs. And family members and friends would talk to them and try to convince them that they were leading a very destructive lifestyle. And they didn't listen, and they didn't change their habits until they decided that enough was enough. And at that point, a change could take place. And so this is where this young man is. And so, a lot of times we do some crazy things, thinking that just got to get past today. But thankfully, my brothers made it past this point, that they didn't hurt themselves or someone else very seriously. And in fact, I've got one relative that doesn't remember a few days of his life, but he was at work. He drove in Houston and went to work, but he doesn't remember it. But he clocked in. There's a record that he clocked in, clocked out, but he has no recollection of it, which is really, really bizarre. So I didn't think you could do that. But also in verses 18 and 19, for some reason, this son thinks that he has some sort of bargaining power with his dad. So he says right here, he says, I'll go back and I'll tell my father that I've sinned against heaven and against him, and make me like one of your hired servants. Like, he's at when you go to any kind of a negotiating class, it tells you, you're taught to evaluate where what your bargaining position is. This guy has a very, very weak bargaining position. So he's not in the position to go to his dad and make another demand that says, hey, I know I've sinned against you, but make me like one of your servants, And his dad could go, I got nothing, But he figures he's got nothing left to lose, right? What's the worst that can happen? He could end up feeding pigs again, and a little closer to home maybe, I don't know. But at least at this point, he understands his situation, and he's willing to acknowledge that he was at fault and that he hurt his father. Because he's willing to go to his dad and say, I've sinned against heaven and against you. And so that's a progress, He's taken a step. I'm sorry? Arrogance is leaving him. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, he's You're right. You're right. That's right. And all of his thoughts were about himself, and now he's at the point where he realizes he can't do it on his own. He needs help. And he knows this, hopefully, because I'm going to go bargain with Dad and see if he'll take me back. I think you're right, and I think we're going to see that in just a second when he returns. So the question at this point is, how many times have we approached God with this very same attitude? Where we say, I know I've sinned against you, God, but I'll promise to do this, whatever that blank is, if you'll rescue me or forgive me again. Right? At least in my case, it's again. I don't know if I'm the only one, but hey. But we do that. We strike these bargains with God. We try to strike bargains with God. And we try to convince him that I'll be better, I'll be a better person, I'll love you more, if you love me more and forgive me again. Okay? So the son's plan is to ask to be made like a hired servant. So when I was reading about this, in that culture at that time, there were actually two types of servants. There was a household servant who actually had living quarters in the house, and their meals were provided, and basically every need that they had was taken care of. And then there were hired servants. They worked out in the fields and outside the house. But they were day laborers, okay? They had no security or longevity. It might be, I guess it's similar to like in our society's culture. If you've ever been to Home Depot on a Saturday morning, there's a bunch of guys out there that you can go and pay them to come to your house and do work for you, okay? I wouldn't have them do real skilled stuff, but anyway. If you need some cleanup or heavy lifting, you can do that. So the hired servants were day laborers with no security or longevity, and not all landowners would pay their hired servants fairly, And so when we look at this, though, we get the impression anyway that the father paid his day servants, his hired servants, fairly, because it says they even had extra food. And if he wasn't paying them fairly, they probably wouldn't have had extra food. And so we can also know from this that he's a fair man. He's a loving man. He's a fair man. And so perhaps the son felt like he could work for the father long enough to earn his love again. And so another question here is, have you ever thought that you have to earn God's love again after you become aware of your sin? I think we do that. Sometimes we're like, uh-oh, it's like getting a lecture from your earthly parent, your dad. And God makes us, the Holy Spirit makes us aware of our sin, and when we confess that sin, then we're like, okay, well, how do I get back into God's good graces? Okay? So if God pulls his love from us for disobedience, then the question is how good or obedient do we have to be to earn back the love of a perfect God? Yeah. If he pulls his love from us for our disobedience, I'm out, okay? I got no chance, okay? So can we ever do enough to be deserving of love from a perfect God, even initially? No. So how good is good enough if we could? I know. But if you had to, so do we just try to cross that threshold back into his good graces? Or do we try to go further and give him everything that we have? Or do we just try to get in? You know, it's like graduating. You know, my daughter once told me when she was in college, she was like, Dad, C's get degrees. And I go, yeah, they pay for their own school too. So, and she was not a C student. I can promise you that. My kids both did better than I ever did in college. So, there's a lot of questions without tangible answers if there's no grace and mercy from God. So I got this. Here's my little visual aid for today. So we don't have a weasel. This is what I needed the easel for. But I'm going to put this right there. So this is God's grace, and this is our life in years. And I realized that the standard is way off of this chart even, okay? So just bear with me. But if God's grace has to be earned, and this is the line, this is how good you have to be, okay? So this is our life in years starting at 0, and so we're good when we're born, right? Because we're an infant. We haven't done anything, okay? So we're good, but shortly thereafter we fall below the line because we lie or we beat up the neighbor kid or whatever, okay? So we're below the line. Then we get a little older and we change a tire for a lady stuck on the side of the road. Oop, we're back above the line. And then we have an impure thought. Oop, we're below the line. And we just keep doing this all our lives. If this was the standard and the way we did it, this will drive you insane. Because you're good, you're bad, you're good, you're bad, you're in, you're out, you know, you're in heaven, you're out of heaven. Oop, I did something good. Now I'm back in. Now I'm out. Now I'm back in. You know, what happens if you die down here? Yeah. Sorry. You know, you got to time these things, you know. and it's impossible, and it's a race you can't win. I mean, that's a roller coaster you don't want to be on. And so thankfully, we have grace and mercy from God that takes us to this top, which is perfection, because of the grace and the blood of Jesus Christ. So we don't have to worry about, are we good enough? You know? That's right. We'll never be. And we're never deserving of his love. Nothing we can do makes us worthy of it, but Jesus Christ said we're worth it. Okay? And so he died for us there. So going on in verse 20 through 24. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. So when the son left, he said, Dad, it's like you're dead to me. And so when he comes back, the father says, the son that was dead is now alive again. And so, and he even says, this son of mine. Okay? So while the son disowned the father when he left, the father never disowned the son. Okay? And I don't think that the father was waiting in the house for the son to return. In fact, it would have been really easy and even justified for the Father to make the Son grovel at his feet. He could have been sitting in big, I don't know, big rock recliner. I don't know. You know, whatever they would have had back in that day. You know, a big chair. And it made the Son come in to him and ask for forgiveness and grovel at his feet. But he didn't do that. In fact, it says here that the Father, well, if he would have made the Son come into the house, the Father would have had the chance to return the humiliation that he had to endure when he left. And he could have told the Son, I knew you'd come back, and you know what? I served you right, you know. But he didn't do that. We're told that the Father saw him while he was a long way off and ran to meet him. Okay? And this part of this story really is the gospel. Okay? And not just the forgiving part, but the whole thing. And so it says that I think that the Father would look for him at different times of the day, every day. I think he went out to the front porch, or just beyond the front porch, or in that culture, maybe up to the rooftop where he could see a long ways off. And he never forgot how his Son carried himself, how his Son looked when he walked. And when he saw him a long ways off, he was like, that's my Son. Okay? And I think that every day he hoped that today would be the day that his Son returned. And all the previous days he was disappointed, because he would go up there and look, no Son today. No Son today. But then the one day he saw him. And he didn't just go, oh, here he comes. Okay, I got to go get ready because he's got to come to me. You know, he took off. And so the Father going out to meet the Son represents the incarnation of Jesus Christ coming to earth. Okay? It's God coming to earth. And Jesus came down to us. He didn't wait for us to come to him begging and stuff. He came to us. Okay? And God didn't wait for us to be good enough to deserve his love, because he knew that it could not happen. Okay? Instead, he came to earth as Jesus, and he meets us where we are, just like the Father ran out to the Son. Okay? And in Luke 19:10, Jesus said to a group of people at Zacchaeus' house, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Okay? So he's not sitting there waiting. He's actively looking. And when we make that first step, he breaks and runs to us. Yeah, that's a big amen. And a big praise. So notice also that the Son had started his prepared speech, and he never got to the make me like one of your hired servants part. Okay, his dad cut him off. Remember, that was what he was going to bargain with, and his dad was like, no, stop. Go get the robe. Give me a ring, sandals. Okay? It says, I don't know if the Father cut him off after he heard his Son acknowledge the sin of his selfishness, and that was all the Father needed to forgive him, or if the Son saw his Father joyfully running toward him, and he was so relieved that he realized he would not try to work a deal. After all, how do you repay that kind of love? You can't. And so when someone gives their life for you, what can you give them in return? The Son could only throw himself onto his Father's mercy. Okay? And so the cross is also in this story. And these are some of the things that I learned. So when I went through this study with Adam. So the cross is also found here. And the cross is represented by the Father running out to meet the Son. Okay? Because in the Middle East, a man of mature years would be careful to walk in a slow, dignified manner. Okay? And people would give respect to someone who presented and carried themselves in that way. Except the Father ran to the Son. And in order to run, if you've got a long robe on, you know, the ladies know this better than we do as men, but they got to hike it up. You got to pull up the robe so that your legs can move, and which you risk the shame of showing your undergarments, you know. So as the father runs off, he's running towards his son, but they, hang on, I lost my spot. Here we go. But so he runs the risk of humiliating himself as he's running out to his son. But also he went to meet his son and express joy. I can only imagine that as the son came back towards the house, whether it was in town or it was a farm or outside of town or whatever, but as he came through town, there were probably some people in that town that recognized him. They probably started jeering him a little bit. Used up all the money, huh? Coming back to suck some more out of your dad, you dog. You know, that kind of stuff. But when the father shows up, the way the father reacts probably caught a lot of those people off guard. They didn't expect the father to come out there. And in fact, what happens is the father came out and hugged him and kissed him, and he stood between the boy and the mocking crowd. Okay? And he probably took some insults also. What are you, crazy? You're forgiving your son after what he did to you? It's a good thing it's not my son. I'd kick him to the curb. Okay? So the father took the humiliation that rightfully belonged to the son. And Jesus endured the humiliation of the cross for the sin of each of us. And so that's where the incarnation of Christ and the cross are in that story. But the father's reaction demonstrated compassion by going to meet him, love by hugging and kissing him, celebration by preparing a feast, and restoration by dressing him in a robe, giving him a signet ring as a member of the family, and giving him sandals that would only be worn by a son and not a servant who would be barefooted. So then we finally get to this other brother in verse 25 through 30. So it says, "Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.'" He's a little upset. He's got a few issues. So the servant tells the brother that his younger brother is here, and he's not at all happy about it. And so he refuses to go inside. So again, notice what the father does. He goes out to his other son. He didn't just go, "Well, too bad. He'll just have to get happy again later." Okay? He went out to go and talk to his older son, just like he went to the younger son. And the father could have been a little upset with the older son and told him, "Get over yourself, come inside or go out there, but don't sit out here and be in the way." Okay? So the older son's anger is rooted in his obedience to the father and his perception that he has earned and deserves the grace and love of the father, whereas the younger brother deserves to be sent away to fend for himself. That's the older brother's attitude. So it's important to note how the different characters describe the younger brother also. The servant tells the older brother that your brother has come. When the father goes to the older brother and to ask why he's upset, the older brother refers to the younger brother as this son of yours. He doesn't claim any relation to him at all. He's a dog. He's not my brother. Okay? So the older brother also assumes how the money was squandered, because nowhere in the story are prostitutes mentioned other than here, And the older brother has obviously not talked to his younger brother because he can see out of both eyes. I'm guessing that the older brother wanted to smack him. So it was probably, it may have been a good assumption that that's what he used some of the money for, but we don't know that for sure. And he probably spoke without knowing all of the facts. Again, which happens a lot in our society, right? Huh? It's probably a fair assumption, but he doesn't know for sure. So the older brother feels cheated because he feels his obedience has gotten him nothing, while the younger son's disobedience gets him a party. Okay? So then the last couple of verses here, it says, "My son," the father said, "you are always with me. And everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Okay? So the father doesn't point out the older son's petty jealousy, which would have been really easy, you know. But he reminds him that every need he has ever had, has been taken care of. Okay? And that everything the father has is the son's, which is an accurate statement at this point. Because if the father gave the 1/3 to the younger son and he went off and squandered it, everything else belongs to the older son. Okay? So notice how the father describes the younger son to the older son. This brother of yours. You know, he said this son of yours, and he says this brother of yours. He's still your brother is what he's telling him. Okay? And he says, so what's the focus of the older brother? His focus was on himself, just like the younger brother's focus was on himself too. Okay? And he thought he deserved and maybe even felt threatened by what he might lose. Because if the younger son comes back and the father decides to split the inheritance again, then the younger son's getting some of my stuff. Okay? So there's a lot of selfishness in the older son too. Okay? So many people spend their whole lives trying to justify themselves by their own righteousness, good works, and obedience, and comparing their holiness to others, which is the problem. Okay? Because we tend to compare ourselves to others instead of understanding that we do not have to and cannot please a holy and perfect God with our actions. In fact, the only work that we can do to please God is to accept the grace that Jesus provides as our Savior. Everything else, he's like, yeah, I could have done that. I didn't need you. I could have done that. Okay? So we tend to get mixed up on grace and works. And I think it's because we're taught from a very young age that nothing is free. How many of you have said that to your kids? I've said it to mine. Nothing's free. There you go. It's not even totally made with paper, but there's a lot of cotton and linen in it. But so when we, you know, we're taught that if you want to improve your situation, you got to work harder. You know? And that works for most things, thankfully. It works for most things, but thankfully, it doesn't work, and it doesn't apply to God's grace and mercy. You know, because how good is good enough? You know? So think of it as a horse and a cart. This is an illustration I've used before. So the horse is grace, and the cart is our works. Okay? So if we're... Now I can't see my notes. So, if we don't do things to earn God's favor. We do things because we have been given God's favor. And so, if we put the cart in front of the horse and we say we got to do these things to earn God's grace, have you ever seen a horse pushing a cart? Doesn't go very far. Okay? It's like being stuck in mud. You know, you spin your wheels a lot, but you just don't get anywhere. And we're working like crazy. We're not really accomplishing much. And even the things that we do accomplish, they don't have any lasting effect. They're temporary. Okay? But if we remember that we've been given grace from God, so therefore we should be more inclined to live in obedience and do works for God, then the horse goes before the cart and you pull them along. Okay? So our motivation for things changes at that point. We have the opportunity to do meaningful things that have eternal longevity. Okay? And so in conclusion with this, when we examine our own lives in light of this parable, which character are you most like? Okay? Are you more like the younger son, and you've spent all your time and effort running from God, trying to do things on your own and prove yourself worthy of all the things that you have because you've deserved them, you worked hard for them, you pulled yourself up? But be careful what you wish for, because sometimes you get it. Or are you more like the older son, who has spent most of your life obedient to God? You may have been raised in church. You don't really have many memories of disobedience to your parents, teachers, or God, which that's not me. So do you feel like God should be gracious to you because you've done the right things and it's hard to find anyone that would have something bad to say against you? Okay? In other words, do you deserve the things that you have because of your own accomplishments, skills, or abilities? So do you see the similarities between the brothers now? A little bit better maybe? Or are you like me, where you're like both of the brothers at different points in your life? You know, the younger son, until I heard the gospel and became aware of my disobedience to God, also known as sin, and repented and asked for forgiveness. Then after a number of years of trying to live the proper Christian life, I was like the older son that felt like God should bless me because I've been good. And sometimes I even became bitter of those that found grace after what seems a lifetime of rebellion towards God. When they're older. I'm like, man, that guy, I know that guy. I've known that guy for 25 years. Ooh. But we should be inside celebrating whenever our brother or sister comes home to God, no matter when it is or who it is. We should be inside celebrating with the family. But a lot of times we harbor some of that bitterness, and we don't want to go inside. And we wonder what that person's doing there. Because we know, that's a good thing about not growing up in Silsbee. Is all of the people that know me as 12-year-old Mark, 13-year-old Mark that was fighting and stuff like this all the time, those people don't live in Silsbee. So I moved here as 21-year-old Mark, so people only know me from that point on. Yeah. You could go and talk to the youth too. I share with them the stupid things I've done all the time. But so the brothers have in common, they thought they could earn the favor of the father by working harder to please the father. Both of them did. The younger son, because of his previous disobedience and determination to work back into the good standing of his father, and the older son that thought all of his previous obedience was good enough to have earned the love of his father. But what they both also had in common was that they were naive or ignorant, whichever word you want to use. But they already had a patient father that loved them, and their actions would not change that fact. Yeah. So, if you're still waiting until you feel that you've changed enough for God to accept you, let me ask you this previous question again. How good or obedient do we have to be to earn the love of a perfect God? Stop trying to earn his love and realize that he's already given it to you. Okay? Romans 5:8 says that God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Okay? And just remember that the only work that we can do to please God is to accept the grace that Jesus provides as our Savior. We're just about done. It went longer than I thought. I was worried that we'd get out here in 20 minutes. But if you have questions about this, I would love to try to answer them for you. If you're online, watching online, and you have questions, and if you would feel more comfortable talking to Brother Bill or Adam or Jeff, call the church office tomorrow and make an appointment to call them, or to talk with them. But lastly, if you think that you're most like the father in this story, you missed the whole point of this parable, and you should go back and watch this lesson again. Just saying, I'm just saying, okay? Because God is the father in this story, and if you identify with that, you've missed it, okay? So, but let's, any questions, comments? Thank you.